Everyone in the room would later agree on one thing. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez chose the wrong day to try to embarrass Barron Trump. The moment her words cut across the chamber, sharp and rehearsed, nobody imagined the boy they remembered from awkward photographs would answer. Nobody expected his reply to be so precise, so cold, that it would leave her staring at him in absolute silence. It felt like history bending. That morning had started like any other gray day in Washington, with motorcades slicing through the mist and reporters hunting for controversy in every passing limousine. Barron arrived at the Capitol as a formality, a political prop more than a guest. Invited to watch another brutal hearing targeting his father's administration. He wore the suit his mother had picked, but the guarded distance in his eyes belonged entirely to him. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had spent the previous night rehearsing lines with her staff, fine-tuning every syllable for maximum impact and viral potential. She believed she knew the Trump family well enough to predict their every reaction. Anger, denial, deflection, never vulnerability. When she spotted Barron in the gallery, tall, expression unreadable above the dark railing, she saw not a teenager but a symbol, a soft point in a hard empire tonight. The hearing dragged through statistics and accusations until attention sagged and phones appeared under desks. When her turn finally came, AOC straightened, smoothed her blazer, and let her practiced indignation fill the microphone. She started with policy, with budget lines and broken promises, then twisted the knife toward the personal. With a measured pause, she invoked Barron's name as an example of detached privilege, sheltered wealth, and generational blindness publicly. A crackle of energy lit the chamber. Staffers leaned forward, already imagining headlines. Progressives would cheer, conservatives would rage, and another clip would be born for the endless battlefield of social media. For a heartbeat, Barron felt the old familiar heat flood his face. The sting of strangers using his existence as ammunition. But then the anger cooled into something sharper, a decision forming like glass under sudden pressure inside. He rose before any advisor could stop him, before protocol could wrap its hands around his shoulders and press him back into invisibility. The Secret Service agents shifted, eyes narrowing, but the president's son simply adjusted his cuffs and walked toward the edge of the gallery. Every camera swiveled, every whisper died. He was stepping out of the role history had written for him and choosing his own lines today. When he spoke, his voice carried a calm weight utterly at odds with his age. He did not defend policy, or his father, or the tower of decisions that had built their controversial empire. Instead, he addressed AOC directly, not as a congresswoman, but as an adult who had chosen a teenager as collateral damage. Every syllable landed like a quiet indictment, exposing cruelty dressed as moral courage that night. He reminded her, without raising his voice, that children of politicians did not choose campaigns, scandals, or security details. He spoke of growing up as an easy target for people who vowed to protect the vulnerable, yet found it effortless to mock a boy for headlines. Then he asked her, simply, what justice could ever be built on humiliating someone who could not vote against her in any meaningful way? The chamber did not erupt, it imploded. The usual chorus of shouts and procedural objections never came, smothered beneath the raw discomfort of watching power misfire on live television. AOC opened her mouth, searching for a rebuttal, a clever twist, anything to regain altitude. Nothing arrived. Her famous fluency deserted her, leaving only a stunned quiet as dozens of lenses framed her frozen, wordless expression for the entire world watching. Barron sat down again without ceremony, pulse pounding, but gaze steady, as if he had merely answered a question in class. Somewhere in the building, a phone buzzed with the first notification, his name climbing into trending lists like a storm front. AOC swallowed, feeling the fracture where certainty had lived. Outside, thunder rolled over Washington, as though something vast had shifted, and nobody yet knew its cost that day. Washington liked to pretend it had seen everything, but the minutes after Barron Trump's reply proved otherwise. The chamber had barely emptied before the clip of his calm, cutting words was already racing through phones and televisions, replayed in living rooms and bars like an impossible sports upset. Staffers who had looked away during the exchange now watched it on loop, drawn back to the stunned silence that followed his final question. In the motorcade, Barron sat opposite a dark window that reflected his own face back at him, pale under the passing streetlights. Notifications stacked on his phone so fast the screen looked like it was shaking. Praise, disgust, and disbelief poured in with the same frantic urgency. One headline called him the quiet Trump who finally spoke. Another framed him as a calculating weapon. But he read only the names classmates, strangers, distant relatives, suddenly remembering his number. On cable news, a host replayed the instant AOC's expression collapsed, freezing the frame to diagram the shift in power second by second. Analysts argued about civility, about the children of politicians, about whether Barron's words had been spontaneous or rehearsed somewhere deep inside the West Wing. They spoke of him as an idea, not a person. while every syllable of his own voice still echoed uncomfortably in his chest. A small ticker at the bottom of the screen acknowledged what none of them could spin away. She had not answered him. Across town, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stood in her office, shoes off, blazer hanging from a chair like a discarded costume. Her staff orbited in anxious circles, offering talking points, threads, explanations, while every screen around them froze on her shocked face. She had spent years building a persona that punched upward, never down. Tonight, the footage painted her as the bully in a cafeteria, and the dissonance lodged in her throat like a stone she could not swallow. She replayed the sound of his question with the volume low, stripped of the crowd's gasps and murmurs. There had been no swagger in his tone, no triumph, only a thin blade of disappointment aimed at someone who claimed to defend the vulnerable. For a fleeting second, she saw herself through his eyes, not as the fearless progressive from New York, but as another adult using a teenager's life as a prop in a larger war. In the back of the limousine, Barron finally accepted a call routed through the White House switchboard. His father's voice arrived with its usual mix of showman's bravado and seasoned calculation, but beneath it ran an edge of pride he tried not to reveal. Donald congratulated him for owning the moment, then shifted quickly to warning. From now on, every word, every pause, would be replayed, dissected, and used by both allies and enemies. Melania's voice followed, softer, cutting through her husband's booming certainty like a thread of smoke. She did not speak of optics or strategy. She asked if Barron's hands were still shaking, if he had eaten, if he wished he had stayed seated. When he admitted he wasn't sure yet, she fell silent for a long breath in which he could hear every year she had spent trying to keep him outside the blast radius of public life. Tonight, he had stepped into the center of it on his own, and nothing she did could pull him fully back. Hours later, after staff had gone home to fight the battle online, AOC sat alone with the volume muted on a replay of the confrontation. Without commentary, the scene changed shape. No graphics, no slogans, just her leaning forward, eyes bright with intent, and him standing up as if weighed down instead of inflated by his own last name. For the first time that night, she wondered how many times he had been talked about in rooms like this without ever being allowed to answer. Twice, she drafted a statement. One version leaned into defiance, insisting on the right to question any symbol of power, even the children of a president. The other bent toward apology, admitting the line between accountability and cruelty had blurred. Both felt dishonest in different ways, like borrowed speeches from lives she had not lived. She closed the laptop, leaving the cursor blinking in an empty field, the unsaid words more powerful than anything she could post. Outside, the Capitol dome burned softly against a sky smeared with city haze, its reflection shivering in the dark river below. Sirens wailed somewhere in the distance as Barron lay awake in his room, phone face down, staring at the ceiling as though it might offer a verdict. Between his words and her silence, something had shifted in the country's story, stretching unseen across the night like a fault line waiting for the slightest pressure to decide whether it would crack open into healing light or into a deeper, colder darkness. By morning, the country had a new obsession and two unwilling protagonists trapped at its center. Barron woke to a world where his name was no longer a footnote under his father's, but the headline itself, stamped across talk shows and political podcasts that had never said more than 3 words about him before. He lay in bed, phone hovering above his face, scrolling through interpretations of a moment that had felt, to him, almost accidental. Commentators were already building a mythology around his composure, sketching him as either a cold-blooded heir to power or a reluctant truth-teller dragged into the arena. He knew neither version fit, but narratives didn't wait for permission to exist. At breakfast in the White House, the dining room felt smaller than usual, the air thick with an unspoken awareness that something had shifted overnight. A television mounted in the corner played muted coverage of the confrontation on loop, the host's lips moving beneath colored banners that shouted his name. Donald watched the screen with the satisfaction of a gambler seeing a wild card land in his favor, while Melania studied only her son's face. "You understand," his father said finally, cutting into the silence like another camera flash, "that this doesn't go away today. You made an entrance. People will want an encore." His tone walked the line between encouragement and command. Barron took a sip of coffee that suddenly tasted too bitter and set the cup down with deliberate care, as if the table might shatter under a misplaced gesture. In Alexandria's apartment in D.C., the morning was quieter but not gentler. She had escaped her office the night before, only to find the storm waiting for her in every notification, every tag, every clip sliced and remixed to make her look monstrous or martyred, depending on the audience. She'd slept in fragments, jolted awake by phantom echoes of his question. Her staff group chat was already buzzing by the time she opened her eyes. Sympathetic journalists offering friendly interviews, activists demanding she double down, others urging her to apologize before the narrative calcified completely. She scrolled through all of it and felt oddly distant, like someone reading about a character who just happened to share her name. The first real shock of the day arrived not from critics or supporters, but from an unexpected corner. A major network wanted a joint town hall, Barron and AOC, on stage together, in conversation about power, privilege, and the next generation of American politics. The producer's email dripped with the language of healing and dialogue. But beneath it, Alexandria recognized what it truly was: ratings bonanza dressed up as national therapy. Her chief of staff argued that declining would make her look afraid. Another aide insisted accepting would only feed the spectacle and risk making him look like the reasonable one again. For a moment, she considered deleting the email, pretending she had never seen it. But the image appeared anyway in her mind: a stage, 2 chairs, and the unscripted tension of proximity. On the other side of the city, Barron was hearing a similar pitch in a more crowded room. Advisors floated the town hall idea with the cautious enthusiasm of people who knew opportunity when they saw it, but also knew how quickly opportunity could detonate. They used phrases like reframing the moment and showing your maturity to the nation. Donald liked the sound of all of it. Melania's silence, at the edge of the table, spoke louder than any endorsement. "What if I don't want to be a symbol?" Barron asked, surprising even himself with the bluntness of the question. The room paused as if the air had misheard him. A communications director smiled tightly and replied that not wanting to be a symbol had never stopped the country from making one out of anyone. The only choice he really had now, she suggested, was what kind of symbol he would allow himself to become. For hours, the decision hung in the balance. 2 separate lives circling the same proposition. Alexandria paced her living room, TV off, the city's sirens drifting through thin walls. She thought about the girl she had been, the one who would have despised any politician who hurt a kid to land a punch on a president. She imagined sitting across from him with no podium to hide behind, no parliamentary rules to lean on. Barron wandered the West Wing corridors like someone walking through a museum of expectations. Built for him before he could spell the word future. Portraits of past presidents stared down, as if measuring the risk of his next move. Every hallway carried whispers of what his father might want, what the party might need, what the public might devour. Nowhere in that echo was there room for what he, personally, could live with. That night, the network sent a follow-up. The offer would expire in 24 hours. Scarcity was part of the spectacle. Social media accounts, sensing the possibility, began to buzz with speculation and demands, framing the still hypothetical event as either a necessary reckoning or a shameless circus. Hashtags bloomed like bruises across platforms. Near midnight, 2 separate cursors blinked over 2 separate draft replies. In Alexandria's inbox, the email to the producer began with, "I will do it, but on my conditions." In Barron's, the response started with, "If I agree. This can't be a stunt." Each hesitated over the send button, fingers hovering as if they could feel the weight of an unseen audience on the other side of the screen. In that suspended moment, before any answer left their devices, the world outside continued to spin, unaware that a single tap from each of them might set the stage for a confrontation far more dangerous than the first. Because this time, there would be no surprise, no accidental heroism, no unplanned silence. This time, both of them would walk onto that stage knowing exactly what the other was capable of and exactly how much there was left to lose. The studio was a cathedral of intention: steel beams and LED panels designed to swallow doubts and amplify certainties. 2 chairs sat in the center of a wooden platform, angled slightly toward each other, close enough to suggest intimacy but far enough to permit escape. The producers had spent hours debating the exact distance, calculating the optics of proximity like physicists measuring gravity's pull. Barron arrived first, moving through backstage corridors with the gait of someone learning his own body one step at a time. Hairstylist hands touched his head. Makeup artists insisted his cheeks needed brightening, his lips less pale. When they finished, he barely recognized the polished reflection in the mirror, not more like himself, but like a version of himself designed for consumption. Through the thin walls, he could hear the audience settling into their seats, the static of anticipation building like pressure before a storm. Alexandria came through the other entrance, and their eyes met for a fraction of a second in the corridor. Neither smiled, neither nodded. They simply acknowledged each other's existence across 12 feet of empty space, and in that silence lived all the previous nights, all the sleepless calculations, all the versions of this moment they had rehearsed alone in their separate rooms. A producer gently guided them to their places, and the audience erupted in a roar that sounded less like applause and more like a collective gasp that had finally found its voice. The moderator was a seasoned journalist, known for her ability to extract truth from the unwilling. She began with housekeeping ground rules: no interruptions, mutual respect, all the procedural niceties designed to contain what everyone knew was fundamentally uncontainable. She asked opening questions about civility in politics, about the responsibility adults bore toward younger generations, Questions designed to warm the room before driving toward the conflict everyone had paid to witness. Barron answered with careful precision, acknowledging the weight of his position without claiming victimhood. He spoke about growing up in public spaces designed to humiliate, about the thin line between legitimate criticism and psychological cruelty. His voice was measured but not cold, there was pain in it, but pain worn so long it had become part of his posture rather than a fresh wound. The audience shifted, realizing this was not the performance they had anticipated, but something closer to confession. When Alexandria spoke, she did not defend her previous words or apologize for them outright. Instead, she talked about the fury that drove her, the rage at injustice that sometimes found its targets indiscriminately. She admitted, with visible difficulty, that she had viewed him as a symbol rather than a person that day in the Capitol. She did not excuse this, only named it. And in the naming admitted something: she had spent the last 72 hours trying not to feel shame. The moderator leaned forward. "Congressman Trump, how do you respond to that?" Barron waited longer than was comfortable before speaking. "I don't forgive you," he said finally. "But I understand why you did what you did, and I don't hate you for it. I think you're a person trying to fix things that genuinely need fixing, and sometimes that makes you careless about who you hurt." He paused. "That doesn't make it okay. It just makes it human." The audience held its breath as if any sound might shatter the fragile honesty in the room. Alexandria's face moved through several emotions, in successions, something like relief, something like grief, something like the terrible clarity of seeing yourself through someone else's eyes and not liking what you recognize. She spoke then about her childhood, about her own father's death, about the way loss transforms into anger and anger into action, sometimes misdirected, sometimes weaponized. She talked about the young woman she had been and the woman she was becoming, and acknowledged that one did not automatically excuse the other. She looked directly at Barron when she said, "What I did was wrong. Not because you're a kid or because your last name is Trump, but because I turned a person into a punchline, and I'm trying to be better than that." For the first time on stage, Barron smiled, not a politician's smile, but something smaller and more genuine. "I think you meant it," he said, "and I think that matters." The conversation deepened from there, peeling back layers of motivation, expectation, and the strange burden of living inside a family's mythology rather than outside of it. They discussed education, wealth, responsibility, and the peculiar isolation of being a symbol to people who would never know you as a person. The audience found themselves invested not in seeing one destroy the other, but in watching two intelligent, complicated humans navigate an impossible landscape together. When the moderator asked about forgiveness, Barron said something that would later be quoted across every platform. "Forgiveness isn't something you deliver on a stage. It's something you live. We don't owe the world a redemption arc just because they watched us fight. We owe ourselves the chance to do better next time." Alexandria nodded slowly. "And I will do better," she said. "Not because it benefits me politically, but because I believe it's right." The final question came from the audience, submitted through cards and online submissions, voted on democratically by viewers who wanted to know the same thing. Would they work together? Could they find common ground despite everything that had passed between them? Barron and Alexandria exchanged a look that lasted only seconds but seemed to encompass entire conversations happening in the space between their eyes. "I don't know," Barron said honestly, "but I'd be open to it. I think we both care about things that matter. Maybe there's a way to do that without destroying each other. I'd like that." Alexandria added quietly, "And I'm sorry it took this public humiliation for me to see it." When the show ended, the applause was different from what had come at the beginning, less a celebration of conflict and more a recognition of something rarer. The possibility of growth, of accountability, of two people choosing to be complex instead of caricatures. Backstage, as they both moved toward their respective exits, Barron paused. He turned and extended his hand to her. For a moment, Alexandria stared at it as though it might contain a trap. Then she understood. It was only an offer of peace, as simple and as difficult as that. She took it, shook it firmly, and in that grip lived the exhaustion of honesty, the fragility of changed minds, and the strange courage required to admit wrongdoing on a stage where millions could judge your every tremor. Outside, the night had turned crisp and clean, the city's noise receding into the distance. Tomorrow, the think pieces would begin, the analyses, the political calculus about what this reconciliation meant and whom it served. But tonight, in the space between what was said and what was understood, something genuine had emerged. Not redemption, not friendship, not forgiveness. But the rarest thing of all, the acknowledgement that another person's humanity was worth the cost of examining your own. 6 months later, the world had moved on to other dramas, other conflicts, other moments demanding national attention. The viral clip had been superseded by 1,000 other controversies. The town hall faded into the archive of televised events that once seemed monumental and now felt quaint. But for Barron and Alexandria, the real work had only just begun. Barron sat in a nondescript office building in Manhattan, waiting for a meeting that would change his trajectory in ways he couldn't yet articulate. He was no longer simply the president's youngest son, no longer a symbol of Trump dynasty privilege waiting passively in galleries. He had become something more complex, a young man with a voice, a perspective, a willingness to challenge assumptions even those of his own family. The think tank he was consulting for had reached out after the town hall, offering him a role in policy development, specifically around generational economics and the intersection of wealth and responsibility. It was ostensibly nonpartisan, though everyone knew the gravitational pulls operating beneath such language. But Barron had made a calculation. He could sit silent and comfortable in the Trump universe, or he could step into spaces that required intellectual honesty over ideological loyalty. When he told his father about the position, Donald had been characteristically pragmatic. Make money, gain credibility, stay ahead of the narrative, the president had advised, reducing complex moral choices to manageable business metrics. Melania had simply looked at her son and said, "Be yourself, and the money will follow." He wasn't certain which parent's advice was more dangerous. Alexandria's trajectory had bent in a different direction, one shaped less by opportunity and more by accountability. After the town hall, she had taken a leave of absence from Congress. Stepping back from the relentless pace of performative activism that had defined her career, she spent 3 months in therapy, examining the roots of her rage, the mechanisms that transformed genuine concern into weapons deployed against easy targets. When she returned to the House, she was quieter but sharper, less interested in viral moments and more committed to legislative work that happened in committee rooms and strategy sessions. Her staff noticed the change immediately. The performative edge had dulled, replaced by something less aesthetically pleasing but more genuinely useful. She had become harder to quote, easier to underestimate, and therefore infinitely more dangerous to those who opposed her actual agenda rather than her rhetoric. Their paths crossed again at a climate policy forum, 6 months almost to the day after the town hall had aired. The moderator asked them to share a panel, and neither declined. They had moved past the point of symbolic gestures. This was simply to people with overlapping concerns and divergent philosophies attempting to find common ground on specific issues. On stage, they argued. It was real argument, not performance. Alexandria pushing for aggressive mandates, Barron advocating for market-based incentives, both of them citing data, research, expert opinion. The audience, expecting reconciliation or renewed conflict, instead received something far more valuable, a demonstration that intellectual disagreement did not require personal animosity. After the panel ended, they grabbed coffee in the green room. The guards and handlers dissolved into the background as they actually spoke to each other for the first time since the town hall. Barron asked her how her hiatus had been. Alexandria asked him about his work at the think tank. These were not loaded questions, just the ordinary inquiries of two people who had been shaped by an extraordinary moment. "I used to think," Alexandria said carefully, stirring sugar into her coffee, "that winning meant making the other side look bad. I didn't understand that you could actually believe something different without being a bad person." She paused. "I'm still learning that lesson." Barron nodded. "My father taught me that everything is a transaction. I'm learning that some things aren't." He smiled slightly. "We're both slow learners." They didn't become friends, exactly, but something adjacent emerged: a mutual respect, born from the recognition that growth was possible, that people could change their minds, that the world was large enough to contain multiple valid perspectives without requiring mutual destruction. Over the following year, they collaborated on a white paper about generational economics, bringing together progressive and conservative frameworks into something that satisfied neither ideological camp completely, but served the actual complexity of policymaking. It was unglamorous work, done mostly in documents and video calls, the opposite of everything that had initially made them famous in each other's presence. The media largely ignored it. There were no viral moments, no dramatic exchanges, no moments designed for social media. There was only the quiet work of two intelligent people, attempting to solve actual problems rather than score points in an endless culture war. By year 2, Barron had become a voice within Republican circles pushing for generational accountability, questioning blind loyalty, suggesting that true conservatism meant conserving actual values rather than merely defending the powerful. It was not a popular position, and it cost him. Family dinners became strained. Certain advisors distanced themselves. Alexandria continued her legislative work, gradually building a coalition around economic issues that transcended traditional party lines. It was slower work than firebrand activism, less immediately gratifying but infinitely more substantive. She discovered that real power didn't come from being right in public. It came from being right in committee, from building coalitions, from the patient work of making systems actually function. They ran into each other at a policy conference 2 years after the town hall, and Barron asked her to dinner. Not a strategic dinner, not for media purposes, but because they had become colleagues and, in their separate ways, friends. Over wine and careful conversation, they acknowledged something neither had expected, that collision had transmuted into collaboration. That the moment everyone had expected to define them permanently had instead become the beginning of something more interesting than either's public persona. Do you ever regret it? Alexandria asked, standing up that day. Barron considered the question seriously. Every day and not at all, he said finally. It opened a door I didn't know existed. But it also made certain things impossible. I can never fully belong to the Trump machine anymore, even though I'm still a Trump. I exist in the margins now, and that's a lonely place. But it's yours, Alexandria said. And he understood that she meant it, that she recognized the cost of authenticity in a world designed to reward performance. 3 years after the town hall, when pollsters and analysts began speculating about 2028, a surprising demographic emerged. Voters who rejected traditional political categories, who admired both Barron Trump and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, not for their ideologies but for their demonstrated capacity for growth, their willingness to update their thinking, their refusal to be trapped in the amber of their worst moments. Neither had anticipated becoming symbols of something new, a post-partisan possibility, a suggestion that the future might not require total war between irreconcilable worldviews. It was a strange and fragile thing, this new symbolism, and both were cautious about what it meant. In private conversations, Barron admitted to Alexandria that he often wondered what would have happened if he had stayed seated that day, if he had chosen silence instead of words. She told him that she wondered to what silence might have cost her, what she might have become if she had never been challenged publicly to examine her own cruelty. We helped each other, Alexandria said simply, even though it didn't feel like help at the time. On a spring evening, 5 years after their first confrontation, they stood together at an event honoring young voices in politics. The moderator asked them about that moment in the Capitol, the clip that had reshaped both their trajectories. Barron smiled and said it had been the most important accident of his life. Alexandria called it a correction course she didn't know she needed. What would you say to your younger selves? The moderator asked, the versions of yourselves from before that day. Barron spoke first. I'd say that being right in a moment is much less important than being good over time. Alexandria nodded slowly. I'd say that the people you're angry at are often mirrors. Look carefully before you throw stones. As they left the stage together, not quite friends but something beyond colleagues, the audience applauded. Some were clapping for what they represented politically, others for the simple fact that two people had managed to grow in public, to change, to become more complex versions of themselves without requiring anyone else to remain static. In the wings, a young staffer asked a producer what had changed between them, what had transformed confrontation into collaboration. The producer shrugged. Time, she said simply. And the willingness to be wrong. Outside, the city pulsed with its eternal urgency, demanding new dramas, new scandals, new moments to devour. But in the green room, Barron and Alexandria were simply two people reviewing notes for tomorrow's meeting, discussing policy details, existing in the ordinary space of professional collaboration that no camera could capture and no headline could quite convey. The story, it turned out, was not about a brutal takedown or a viral moment. It was about what came after the harder, quieter, more profound work of becoming someone better than the world expected, of allowing yourself to be changed by your adversaries, of recognizing that growth sometimes requires standing up, but always requires sitting down afterward and listening. The Capitol dome glowed against the evening sky. And somewhere inside those marble walls, history continued to be written, not in moments of spectacle, but in the patient, unglamorous accumulation of small decisions to be better than before, to understand more than yesterday, to love the country enough to challenge it, and the people in it enough to see them as something more than symbols. In the end, that was the real story, not the confrontation, but the reconciliation, not the silence, but what both of them learned to say in the years that followed.